So says the Gemara, just background, I don't know where you're holding, where it's a discussion of Yain Nesech, which is a consuming discussion in this Masechta. And the
Nun
question,
chet,
I'm sorry,
nun chet.
Nun Chet Amud Bet.
Gotcha. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
6 lines from the bottom. It says Reish Lamed, which stands for Reish Lakish. But
Okay.
the discussions yesterday and last week, a bunch of them were about what to do if a non-Jew touches wine, right? So obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but I'll say it. If a Ove Kochavim is min nasech, which means he pours wine, or he or she, for libations to an idol, that is considered yain nesech, and it is prohibited b'hana'ah. It's prohibited to eat. It's prohibited to sell. That's clear, right? That we had another category called stam yenam, which is wine we don't know what the status is, and there was a machloket about whether you can't drink it, but whether you can't get hana'ah from it. But now we're discussing a lot of categories of things where a non-Jew touched it, but we don't know if they actually did something inappropriate, right? What's the concern? And we'll see more today. We had some yesterday and before about cases where maybe you don't have to worry about them doing yain nesach, and it would either be permitted or permitted to drink. That's the most extreme case, or permitted to get hana'ah. So today's case is the following. Rish Lakish ikla leBatzra. Rish Lakish went on vacation to a city called Batzra. I don't have any idea where Batzra is. I mean, I have an idea, but it's near the Jordan. It's somewhere in like Petra area. So he got to this area of Batzra. I don't know how Rish Lakish got to Batzra exactly, but somehow Chaza Yisrael deka'achli peirin delo ma'asri. He saw Jews, I guess, who lived in Batzra, eating fruits that they didn't take maaser on. And asar, he said to them, asarlu. He said, you can't eat that. You can't eat fruit unless you take maaser on it. So he told him to stop. And Chaza Maya Desagdilo of Chavim, he saw that there was water that was worshipped by Ovdei Avodah Zarah. So they had, the watering hole, the pool was worshipped by them. And he said to the Jews, V'shatu Yisrael, and the Jews were drinking the water, Lasarlo, and he said, you can't drink it. And so he was a real killjoy, right? So he told him, don't eat the food, don't drink the water, and because it's prohibited. Up to the Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Now he got home back to Rabbi Yochanan, who was in Israel, right? Rabbi Yochanan in Tveria. He got home to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan, he told Rabbi Yochanan the story. I went to this place and I couldn't believe what the people were doing. And Amrle Rabbi Yochanan said to Rish Lakish, wait a second, don't even turn your car off. Adem miktorcha alach, while your coat, Adem miktorcha, which is your begadim, are still on you. Don't even take off your coat or take your shoes off. Zil hador, you got to go back there. You told them the wrong thing, and you have a responsibility to go back immediately. Don't unpack your bags and go tell them that you made a mistake. Because Betzer lav hainu batzra. There's a pasuk in the Torah that refers to a city called Betzer Bamidbar, and that is part of Israel. But the city Batzra is not the same as the city Betzer. And so the city Batzra is actually not part of Israel. And because it's not part of Israel, it's outside the borders of Israel, they don't have to take maaser. So your comment to them about taking maaser was incorrect. In fact, there's no responsibility to take maaser in Batzra. You made a mistake and you thought it was similar to the city Betzer. And so you were wrong about that. And furthermore, Mayim shel Rabim ein nesrim. If a non-Jew, an Ovdei Avodah Zarah, bows down to water that is public water, a public fountain or a spring, they can't prohibit it. The fact that they bow down to it does not prohibit my thing. It's public property. It doesn't belong to them. They can't change the status even if they worship it. And so the Jews can go and drink the water. So go back and tell them that you were wrong on both accounts. Says the Gemara, that's Rabbi Yochanan Tameh. In fact, that's Rabbi Yochanan, according to his consistent opinion, the top now of Daf Nun Tet Amud Aleph. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishem Rabbi Shimon ben Yehud Sadak. Rabbi Yochanan is quoted and saying in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehud Sadak that Mayim Shel Rabim of the Avodah Zarah that worship water of the public, ein nesarim, they don't become prohibited through that worship, which implies hadiyachid nesarim, that if a non-Jew had private water, right? He had property and there was water, a spring in his property. Tosfos is a little bothered here. What does private water mean, right? Water is by definition a public event. So Tosfos says that either means, and anyways, he quotes a Gemara elsewhere, which talks about how Yoshua made a takana that no one can own water, right? That water that runs through the public can't be commandeered by an individual. So Tosfos has one explanation that maybe the guy owns the whole city, right? Not the whole city, but the whole area where the water flows. So it's in his property from beginning till end. But the other explanation he gives is that it's not talking about natural flowing water. It's talking about a spring, well. So that if a non-Jew or a Jew digs a well, then he owns that water, right? So you actually, it's natural flowing water that you don't own, but well water you would own. And so because of that, water of a yachid, hi Miriam, we're on the second line of Daf Nun Tet Amud Aleph. And Rabbi Yochanan, I'll read the top line again. Why not? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Shimon Yot Tzaddak. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Mayim shel rabim ein nesarim." The water that's from a public, if someone worships that as Avodah Zarah, he or she can't prohibit it. Had yachid nesarim. So that implies that if you have private water, so to speak, water that's owned by an individual, because he dug the well, let's say, he could prohibit that water. But this contradicts what we said 2 weeks ago, right? It says Gemara, remember we had a whole discussion a couple of weeks ago that you can't, even if you own a mountain, it's in your property, and you bow down to the mountain or the tree, you don't prohibit that thing because it's natural. So how could you prohibit water just by bowing down to it, even if it's your water, right? It's as long as it's attached to the ground, meaning it's still in the spring or in the well, you can't prohibit it. It says cases where there was a wave. A wave came and blew up the water, so it was actually separated from the main part of the water, and the non-Jew bowed down to the great waves, right? He stood there and he bowed down to them. So those, if they're individual, they become prohibited. Says Gemara, well, sof, still, even waves, that's the case of avnei har shnidal deluninu. Remember, this is the case we had 2 weeks ago, where we said if a Ovdei Avodah Zarah bows down to a mountain, the mountain's not prohibited. What about if a stone falls off that mountain and he bows down to that stone? Right, so he didn't remove the stone, right? The stone fell down on its own. So does that stone become, it's still a natural thing, or is it considered now to be something else? And he could answer it. So the fact that Rabbi Yochanan is saying that water that's in individuals could be prohibited implies that if the water blew off the mainstream, that's like a stone that flew off the mountain. So prove from here that it's Rabbi Yochanan, the Amar Asura. Well, not necessarily. The case here might be where you actually lifted the water up with your hands. So there, you took the water and the non-Jew and put it into a container into his hands, and he bowed down to it or he worshipped it. That's where it's prohibited if it's his private water. If it's public, if it's the ocean, and he walks to the Atlantic Ocean and picks up the water and says, "I worship this," he can't prohibit it because it's not his water, right? So that is the case. So that is the case of Reish Lakish. I just want to add, I feel like obligated to do this because there's a Tosfot that consumes almost a whole Amud. And so we have a short daf today. But Tosfot actually deals with this very interesting question. So Miriam, I don't know if you learned it yesterday, but the beginning of the story of Reish Lakish was that he went to this town called Batzra, and he saw people in Batzra, Jews, eating fruit that they didn't take maaser on, right? And he said, that's prohibited. You can't eat it. He got to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, "You made a mistake. Go back and tell him that it's permitted because Batzra is not Betzer. Betzer is a town in Israel. Batzra is not in Israel." So Tosfos asked the question, and this is the lengthy Tosfot. It starts on the bottom of yesterday's page and continues most of today. Why is it true that you don't take, implies from here that you don't have to take maaser on fruit that was grown outside of Israel? And of course, this is a tremendous debate about whether there's a chiyuv in maaser midrabanan, right, on food that goes outside of Israel. Tosfos goes through many variations of this, that it's only chayiv on dagan, tirosh, and yitzar, the big three as we call them, right, that those are the only things chayiv midoraita in Israel, so they're chayiv midrabanan outside of Israel. Tosfos has a whole nother explanation. It's beautiful. I mean, he goes through a lot of it about maybe they only made a takana on food, because then, anyways, Tosfos seems to conclude that the halacha should be that you do take maaser, right? But he asked the question, and I'll quote the question, right? The Tosfos says, this is way somewhere in the middle. I'm having trouble finding it. But Tosfos says, what about nowadays, right? Why in the world don't we take maaser, right? So that's Tosfos' question. Why, I guess in Europe, which we don't do in America, obviously, right? Why don't we take truma and maaser on our fruits and vegetables? And Tosfos comes up with a very, very creative answer, which is fascinating. And he says that nowadays, this is like, I don't know if you want to follow, but it's like 15 lines in the wide lines of Tosfot and Nun Tet Amud Aleph. He says nowadays, all of our land is owned by the local counts, by the sarim. And basically, what he implies is that even if you own land, the government can always come and take your land away from you. So in some ways, it's not really your land. And because there's no real land ownership, and again, this was in Germany in the 12th century, or I don't know what if you'd say the same thing today. And because of that, we're not really the owners of the land, and so it's not owned by us, and we don't necessarily need to take truma and maser. Which, of course, if that reality changed, might change the halacha. He gives another explanation elsewhere later in Tosfot that maybe they didn't make it to Canaan lands that were far away from Israel. It was only if you lived in Jordan and Syria, then you were close. But if you live in America, it's probably not a big deal. So, anyways, it is a huge discussion which has nothing to do with Avodah Zarah from this story of Reish Lakish. But let's go back to our Gemara. So we are at the 6th line from Nun Tet Amud Aleph. Reb Chiya bar Abba, the next story. Reb Chiya bar Abba ikla legavla. He got to a place called Gavla. I don't really recall where Gavla is either. Maybe if someone's got it in their Gemara, but some town. And he saw in this place called Gavla. Is your say, Miriam? Any clues? Probably just says Gavla would be my guess. So he got to this place called Gavla. Again, we're 6 lines from the top. He saw that there were Jewish women who were having children, meaning they were sleeping with non-Jews who were in the process of converting. They had done milah and they hadn't done tefillah, right? So I don't know if it was ideological. They thought that's enough to be Jewish, or they were just they were maybe people who maybe were not Jewish at all, but they had a brit milah, but they weren't complete Jews. They didn't have tefillah. So he saw that. That was one thing that he saw. Chaza, the second thing he saw were 8 lines from the top. Chamra demazgu of dekochavim shatu Yisrael. He saw there was wine where the non-Jews did miziga and Jews were drinking it. We had this Gemara, this is yesterday's Gemara, where let's say you have wine, right? They used to have wine that was very concentrated. They would pour water into it. So if a non-Jew pours water into the wine, the non-Jew has not touched the wine. He just poured the water in. So the wine is sitting there in a container. The non-Jew came and poured the water into this wine. So yesterday we said that was prohibited from a takana, but he saw that they were drinking it. So they would basically have their non-Jewish, their Ovdei Kochavim waiters pour water in, and they didn't touch the wine, but they poured the water in, and the Jews were drinking it. Chazar, and the third thing he saw was Tormusa, the Shalkilu of Ovdei Kochavim va'achli Yisrael. There was this thing called Tormusa. You have an answer for me, Miriam? You're muted.
Okay, so it is it's a city located on the coast of Syria, situated between Latakia and Tartus.
Oh, okay. So thank you. That's helpful. Now that we know where those places are because of the wars, right? But so outside of Israel, presumably, right? But
Yes.
we're talking about the travels. The third thing he saw in this place was that they ate these things called tormusim, which are translated in mine as lupines, which I had to Google. And it says on Google that it's a legume.
It's clearly tiramisu.
Okay. I don't think that's made out of beans, but okay. Maybe someplace in the vegan tiramisu. So they found these legumes that were shalki. They were boiled because they were very hard. You couldn't eat them raw. Obviously, it's like chickpeas, right? And they had to boil them for a long time in order to make them edible. And they were boiled by non-Jews, by Ovdei Kochavim, and the Jews were eating them, which even though we have a problem with bishul akum. Now, Rebbe Chiya bar Abba, unlike Reish Lakish, who was very quick to tell people to stop doing things, he didn't say anything. He just took the notes in his journal about all these things, and he didn't say anything. But when he got back home, he also got back to Rabbi Yochanan, and he told Rabbi Yochanan what happened. And Rabbi Yochanan said, you got to go back there and you got to tell them everything they're doing is wrong. The opposite. Amalei, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, you've got to go back. Their children are mamzerim because they're sleeping with non-Jews. And they can't drink the wine because the non-Jew poured the water into the wine. And they can't eat these turmasim because they're cooked by Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And the reason for the last one, we'll see this in a second, is mishum she'enam b'nei Torah, because they are not b'nei Torah. And we had earlier that we have separate rules, right? For people we think are going to break the rules, we're more strict than for the people we don't think are going to break the rules. So we wanted to make extra harchakot because they don't know the difference, and so they need to be more strict. Now, what's the explanation for all these rules? We're in the first wide line on Nun Tet Amud Aleph. Al b'neihem she'em mamzerim. Why do you have to say that their children are mamzerim? Rabbi Yochanan Tamei. This is Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Then Rabbi Yochanan told us in Yevamot, La'olam eino ger ad she'imo v'tivo. A non-Jew does not become a convert until he has Brit Milah and Tefillah. V'kivan delot tavil, and since they haven't yet gone in the mikvah, ovei kochavimu, it's a non-Jew. And a non-Jew sleeps with a Jew. V'amar Rabba bar bar Chanan, Rabbi Yochanan, ovei kochavim ve'eved haba bat Yisrael, a non-Jew, of the Avodah Zarah, or an Eved who sleeps with a Jewish woman, havlan mamzer. We treat the child as a mamzer. Of course, it's not a mamzer midoraita, right? Midoraita mamzer is if you sleep with an erva, that's an isser karet or an isser mita, which is not the case here, obviously. But they made a takana midrabanan. This was a Gemara in Yevamot that child is treated like a mamzer. The next thing they said, the Bach takes out the word gazur, but he said al yenam mishum yain nesach, and this was what we quoted yesterday, that although the non-Jew didn't touch the wine because he poured the water into it, that's getting very close to touching it. And we make a gzera in that case. Mishum, as we quoted yesterday, lech lech amrin nazira, you go say to a nazir who can't touch wine, or drink wine, schor schor, the karmelo tikrav, go around, don't go near the vineyard. Meaning, don't even allow the non-Jew close to your wine. That's gzera d'Rabbanan, obviously, and it's only assur to drink and not bahana, but it's a assur anyways. And the third halacha was val turmasim mishum bishulei ovdei kochavim. They made it. They said they can't have the legumes, whatever they're called, the lupines. Mishum bishulei ovdei kochavim. The fish einam b'nei Torah. Now that implies that's because they are not b'nei Torah, and if we allow them to eat these things, the next thing you know, they're going to be eating in a steakhouse, right? But says the Gemara, the reason Rabbi Yochanan said it's prohibited is the einam b'nei Torah because they're not educated. Ha b'nei Torah shari. But if they were educated, then presumably you would allow them to eat the lupines that were cooked by non-Jews. How could you allow that? V'amar of Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav, this is Gemara we had 3 weeks ago. Anything that can be eaten raw is not under the category of bishul akum. But legumes are not eaten raw. Nobody can eat raw beans, right? They're hard and they're dry. So since you have to cook this, it should fall under the category of bishul akum. So why would you say that someone who's a ben Torah is allowed to eat this? Says the Gemara, remember there was another version in the Gemara 3 weeks ago about what is excluded from the prohibition of bishul akum. Anything that doesn't go onto a royal table to supplement the bread, that is not fall into the category. And since I guess kings don't eat legumes, or they might eat them, but they don't eat them as a place of honor, as a dip, even though I guess legumes are really a dip. But either way, they don't eat these things. So therefore, these are not prohibited. Taima de'ena b'nei Torah. The only reason it's prohibited is because they're not b'nei Torah. But ha b'nei Torah shari. Had they been b'nei Torah, they would have been allowed to eat these lupines, even though they were cooked by a non-Jew. So that is that story of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. The next question, asked the Gemara, 3 lines on the bottom, first word on the line, is Ba'aminem Rav Kahana. They asked Rav Kahana the following question: Ovei kochavim ma'u sheyolich anavim legat. Can a non-Jew carry the grapes to the threshing floor? Right? We've had a lot of discussions. We're going to have more actually in the next Mishnah about the different steps in the threshing, right, and what's there. But can he carry the grapes to the threshing floor? Now, why in the world would this be a problem? So Rashi doesn't say anything here, but Tosas quotes, I think, a Rashbam who has an explanation. There's actually a debate Tosas has between the Rashbam on the bottom, between what exactly is talking, what are we exactly referring to? And so one explanation is that these are grapes that are sort of laden, they're full grapes at the end of the summer. And as you carry them, they leak a little bit and there's juice coming out of the grapes. And so there is some juice basically there in the grapes. You haven't actually put them into the press yet. That's one possibility why it might be a challenge. Another possibility might be that you're actually talking about him pouring grapes into the gat, but the gat has already been started to be pressing and there's some juice flowing out of the gat. Remember we had yesterday or a couple of days ago that if there's juice actually flowing from the gat and you put grapes in, it's a problem. Here it's sort of dripping out. So it was a middle kind of case. So either way, they asked Rav Kahana, can the non-Jew carry these grapes to the gat? And Amarlu, Rav Kahana said, Asur, don't do it. Why? Really, it's not technically wine, but still, we don't want the non-Jew anywhere near our wine process. Mishum lech lech amrin nazira. This is the quote we say: go, say to the nazir, schor schor, go around, meaning far away. The karmelo tikrav, don't even come near a vineyard. And the same thing is true about a non-Jew. We don't want a non-Jew even close to our process. Ask the Gemara, what about there's a Braita that seems to disagree? Eitvei Rav Yemar, Rav Kahana, Rav Yemar, the student, I guess, in front of Rav Kahana said, what about the following Braita? The Tosefta says, the last line, Oveiko Chavim Shevi Anavim Legat Besalin, a non-Jew who brings the grapes in a sal's a basket, right? Or Bidudoraim, top of Daf Lamid, Nun Tet Amabet, or you go into the Dudarim. Now, Dudarim are, Rashi says, some kind of small barrels, right? You don't know what that French word is, but tulinits. Miriam's going to help us. No, unknown. Okay, unknown French word. So a non-Jew brings these grapes to the vineyard. Sorry, is what does the Braita say? Mutar, right? The grapes are permitted to drink. So you just told me, Rav Kahana, don't do it. It's Nisur Drabanan maybe, but the Braita says that you're allowed to drink it. Amalei, Rav Kahana said, of course, there the case was Hevi Kamrat. It was done already. So the Braita was saying they can drink it. But I'm telling you, don't do it, right? Meaning we don't want you to do it because we want you to have any possible harchakot from the non-Jews being close to your wine press. But if you do it, it's not yain netzach. They didn't actually put wine in, they just put grapes in. So therefore, I said, sorry, I missed some words. Right? The Braita says, even though the wine is dripping from them, it's mutar. So Amalei, so Rav Kahana answered, hey, Vika, you're talking about a case where they already did it, and the Braita says it's mutar. Another chatchila kamina, I was referring to ahead of it. Don't do it. You should try not to do it. If it's done, b'diavad, it would be permitted. Next case, fascinating case on the third line of the Nuntet Amid Aleph. Hahu etroga denafol lechavita dechamra. There was an etrog, big disaster, right? Obviously etrogim were very rare in those days. And they had one etrog and they're holding it. And I don't know why they're doing this, but they're next to the barrel of wine. And someone drops the etrog into the barrel of wine. And everyone's in real tsars. There's a non-Jew, maybe he's one who owned the etrog, who's walking by. Idri Oveiko Chavim, and Oveiko Chavim jumped up, Vishakle, and he reached into the barrel to grab the etrog before it dropped to the bottom, I guess. And all of a sudden, they paused. They're like, oh my God, what do we do? Now there's a non-Jew with his hand, an Oveiko Chavim, with his hand in our barrel of wine. Right, so fascinatingly, we discussed this a little bit last week. It's not prohibited yet because since he clearly was intentionally going to grab this etrog, that we don't think that he was tarred in that. He wasn't thinking about Avodah Zarah. But the problem is that if he pulls the etrog out now, the act of pulling it out, he's misachsech. Remember, he moves around the wine, and that would be yain nesach. So said Rav Ashi, I don't know how long he stood there for, but Rav Ashi said, look, here's what we got to do. Naktul yadeh. Hold his hand, meaning immobilize this guy's hand so the non-Jew cannot move. So he doesn't absorb or push around the wine. What you should do is tip over the barrel until it pours out. So basically, leave him there, immobilize the non-Jew, so he can't move, because if he moved, it would asr the yayin, and pour the wine out of the barrel into another cup, and therefore it would be permitted. Okay? So that's what you should do. Very interesting case, right? So
the entire amount of wine that is left in the barrel.
So Rashi here again, all these cases are very much debated. Rashi says it would be asur to drink, but it would be mutar b'hana'ah.
Yeah.
This whole barrel, everything in the barrel, even what he touched, as long as he didn't move his hand. Because if he moved his hands, then it's considered yain nesach and it would be asur b'hana'ah. But as long as you could prevent him from moving, the going in is not a problem because he was being tarud and doing something, and the coming out he didn't do. So you could siphon out the wine around him. I guess you could get a vacuum and do it also, right? If you could suck it out. But that's what he told them to do. Now, Amar Vashi, said Rav Ashi, the next case, Hi Oveku Chamim, also an interesting case. Let's say there's a non-Jew who's very smart. You learned Daf Yomi a little bit, right? And he's angry. He goes to the store and he says to the Jew, look, I'll buy this barrel of wine from you for $100. And the Jew says it's $500. He says, if you don't give me for $100, I'm going to do yain nesach and you can't drink it at all. So then Oveiko Chavim comes and Naske Lechamra di Yisrael b'kavana. He goes, in order to wreck the Jew, he takes his wine, he pours it out in front of Avodah Zarah. Now says the Gemara, obviously now it's yain nesach, right? So afal gav delizvune Oveiko Chavim achrina asur. Even though the shopkeeper cannot sell it to another Jew, but not to another goy, not to another Jew, but he can't sell it to another non-Jew because it's asur b'hana'ah, like yain nesach. But he can sue and collect $500 from that non-Jew, even though he's now getting basically $500 for his barrel of yain nesach. My timer, why is that permitted? Because mikla kalya, he basically wounded him, he hit him, meaning he's collecting damages. He's not selling his barrel of wine. He's collecting damages that this non-Jew ruined his bottle of wine, right? And Rashi says, for example, mikla kalya means he burned it, but the example, Rashi says the example would be if the non-Jew poured your wine on the ground, right? You would say to him, you have to pay me for the wine. You're not selling him the wine, it's in the ground. So although here the wine is present, you can collect damages from the non-Jew. And says Rav Ashi, Amar Rav Ashi, Minah, how do I have a source for this concept that if the non-Jew does it, sort of to punish you, that it doesn't, you're allowed to basically make them pay. So Titania, it's based on the following Breita. This is again another interesting Breita. The Breita says in Chulin, Oved kochavim shenasach yenosha Yisrael. Let's say a non-Jew comes, he takes the wine of a Jew, and he pours it out as yain nesach. He says, I'm pouring this out for whatever God that he worships, right? But shelo b'fnei avodah kochavim. But there's no idol, right? He's in the Jews' store. There's no icon in front of them. He comes into the store, he takes the wine, he picks it up, he steals it, he pours it down, says, I'm pouring this in front of my God or for the honor of my God, whatever. Says the Breita, asur. That's a problem because it's yain nesach, right? The Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera matirim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera say it's permitted. Why? Even to drink, Rashi says. I'm sorry, not to drink, sorry. Bahana, Rashi says. Why is it mutar? Mishum shnei dvarim. There's two kulas that you can use here. First of all, and this is, again, not a kula that we generally rely on, but you could see how it opens up the paths of heter. First of all, the only issue of nisach hayayin is in front of an idol. If there's no idol there, then it's not nisach hayayin. Now, we don't paskin that way. Of course, this would permit almost everything, right? Because very, very few Jews, even of kochavim, are always in front of an idol. But you're only prohibited, maybe only bahana, if it's done in front of an idol. And furthermore, this is what Rav Ashi was proving it from. The other point is she'omer lo, that the Jew can say to the non-Jew, lo kol himcha shetei aser yeni lo onsi. You can't just force my wine to be prohibited, meaning you can't just turn my wine to Isser without my permission. Now, of course, he can, but the point you see from here is that when it's done by force, even though Rashi says, even though we don't paskin like this, since it's done by force, you see that there's more kulas involved. And the same thing would be true in this case, where the non-Jew came and forced, on purpose, he made the Jews wine yain nesach just to mess him up. You see that you can take more, liberal aspects to it and allow the non-Jew to pay for it. Now, one final case, because it's a short daf, but we're 3 lines in the bottom. Hahu chavita dechamra, there was one barrel of wine, dishtakil lebarza. The big tragedy happened, the barza, the spigot that they had in the wine, fell out or broke. And of course, now the wine's got a hole in it, and the wine's coming out of the barrel. So what do you do? Ata oveko chavim. Now, I guess the person watching it or the person walking by was a non-Jew. And Idri, he jumped up and anach yadei alei. He put his hand on top of the hole to prevent the wine from coming out. So now, this is very interesting, right? Because remember, if a non-Jew pours the wine, it becomes prohibited. Here, he didn't actually pour the wine. He covered the hole so the wine doesn't move. But the reason the wine is not moving is because of his action. So how do you view this? So said Rav Papa, Kol dilahade barza chamra asir. Anything that's in front, I don't really know, it's hard to know how you define this, but anything that is right next to the barza, next to the spigot, the wine is asur, okay, that area. But Rashi again says asur b'hana'ah, which, this is actually, Rashi does not say that. Rashi says asur b'shtiyah, but not b'hana'ah. Okay, so you can't drink, meaning none of it is yain nesach. The goy has not moved the wine at all. But the wine that's right next to the stopper, you can't drink. But idach, the rest of the wine, top of daf samach and alf, is shari, would be permitted. Tos is very bothered by this because it's really strange. How would you drink, right? How could you drink the other wine? It's all a barrel of wine. So what do you mean you drink, right? So Tosa says it's not talking about that. It's all in a question of Isur Hana'ah. And then, of course, you can sell, and say I can sell 50% or 80% of this wine and get Hana'ah from it. But that's Rav Papa's first answer. In Ikadamri, some said that Amar Rav Papa ad habarza, up to the level of the stopper, chamra asir. The wine is asur, meaning everything above it is basically would flow through this hole. And the non-Jew putting his hand on top of it stops all the wine above the spigot from flowing out. And so he indirectly is impacting all that wine, and it would be prohibited. But the percentage that's below the spigot would be permitted. And so that's how you view his energy. And says Rav Yemar, I'm going to do three more lines, if that's okay. Says Rav Yemar, we are at the second wine, now the third. Kitnai. In fact, this is very similar to a Mishnah in Masechet Tful Yom. Mishnah Masechet Tful Yom is talking about a case where you have truma, right? And truma is not allowed to become tamei. But let's say you have the exact same thing. You have a chavit of truma that was nikva. It got a hole in it. And so all of a sudden, the wine of truma is going to pour out of the hole, right? So says the Mishnah in Tful Yom, Bein mipiha, whether the hole is on the top of the barrel, which is presumably where everything pours out of, Bein mishulat, or it's on the bottom of the barrel, which where everything would leak out of if there was a hole. Bein mitzideha, or the hole is on the side of the barrel. If naga ba tful yom tme'ah, if a tful yom touches it, all of the liquid in the barrel becomes tamei. But Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah that's not the case. Mipiha umishulat tme'ah. If it's the top of the barrel or the bottom of the barrel, where either you turn it over and pour everything out, or everything would fall out of, then it's tamei, because by the tamei person closing up that hole, he's preventing all of the liquid from coming out. But mitzideh, if you do it on the side, then Torah mikana mikan. It's only what's next to what he's touching that becomes tamei, but the other sides are things that remain tahor. How you define that is not so clear to me. But the bottom line is that the Rabbi Yehuda is more meko in this case, and says that just having a tamei person touch it does not make all of the wine considered to be supported by his power, and therefore it's not prohibited. And the same thing would be true about the non-Jew, that if he just touched this, it wouldn't all be prohibited necessarily. We are actually, just want to be clear, we're going to continue a little bit tomorrow.
Take the first cup and pour it out.
Sorry, I missed that comment, James?
He would just take the first cup and pour it out. That'd be the wine next to the hole.
Well, the hole, you mean because there's the hole there, you're saying? Yeah, I'm not really sure. To be honest, I don't know how you would define right next to it. Rashi doesn't say.
No, so actually I read something. Let's see. Right next to it, it said the stream of wine adjoining the hole left by the spigot. This would seem to refer to the wine that streamed into the gap in the wall of the cask that had been filled by the spigot.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So but how do you know what's there and what's not? It's all connected, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So Rashi does talk about drinking, and Tosafot has that question. He's like, how in the world could you differentiate? It must be Bana, but I don't. Okay, we'll stop here. God willing, we'll learn tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. I hope everyone can join us, and I will see you then. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.